Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this wonderful Friday morning on the 4th of July, which is also America's Independence Day. So today's webinar takes place at a time of heightened uncertainty, the levels of which have not been this high since the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, I think most people are there. So, welcome. Okay, earlier this year, President Trump imposed both Section 232 tariffs, which have impacted trade globally. South Africa is particularly vulnerable relative to other countries for many reasons, one of which is that trade accounts for 8.5% of our non-gold exports. President Trump also imposed a 10% reciprocal tariff, which, unless a trade agreement is negotiated, will increase to a 30% reciprocal tariff, which is due to come into effect on the 8th of July, next week. What used to be, on average, 0.4% tariff on US imports has increased to 12.6%, and if no trade agreement is reached, the average tariff on US imports increases to 16.8%. What are the most immediate threats imposed by Trump's 2025 tariffs to South Africa's automotive and mining sectors? What are the implications for AGOA? And what are the policy levers available to counteract the loss of competitiveness and sector-specific vulnerability? To unpack these consequences, we have decided to put together a webinar, which is coordinated between the UK-South Africa Independent Economic Partnership Programme and implemented by DNA Economics, URSA, and the ODI. My name is Margot G, and I'm going to be moderating today's event. It is a pleasure to have all of our distinguished guests with us today. To start us off, we will have Professor Lawrence Edwards from the School of Economics at UCT, who is also a research associate at SALDRU and a research fellow at URSA, who will be presenting and condensing a 70-odd page document, research paper he did, on the consequences of recent US trade increases for South African exports. His co-author, Chien, also from UCT School of Economics, is also here today. Following that, we will open up the floor to discussion with two discussants. The first one being Malose Letsoalo, followed by Duane Newman. Malose is the Chief Director responsible for bilateral trade relations for all countries outside the African continent at the DTIC. He was previously the DTIC representative in Washington, D.C. Duane is a partner at Ernst. He has been advising on trade issues since 1994, from policy, trade agreements through to practical customs and duty planning. Duane has advised inward and outward projects across Africa, has a sector focus on automotive and the energy and resource sectors, and is currently the Africa Climate Change and Sustainability Services Leader for Ernst & Young. Thereafter, we will open up for some Q&A, where we encourage the panelists to answer questions from the audience. Attendees, you are invited to send through any questions you have in the chat or the Q&A. If it's directed specifically at someone, please just let us know who you would like to answer your question. I hope you are as excited as I am to hear from these experts and these distinguished trade policymakers. I look forward to hearing what you have to say. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Lawrence to kick it off. Thank you.
Sorry, Lawrence, just before you come in, I just want to say, please don't put your technical questions in the webinar chat. Use the Q&A function, because otherwise we're going to have to field questions from two places and then we're going to lose out. So use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, please. Thanks.
Great. So let me kick off then. Thank you very much for organizing the webinar. It's a great pleasure to present and to discuss some of the recent work that Jing, Chien and myself have been working on, dealing with obviously an issue of great importance. I mean, today is Independence Day, but we actually have the 2nd of April, which was well known as Liberation Day. This is when President Donald Trump introduced the idea of imposing reciprocal tariffs to rid the US of its deficits across all countries in the globe. That was just one intervention of many that's influenced the global economy, including South Africa. But we want to focus in this particular paper on the implications of these many different interventions and tariff shocks that have been imposed on the global order, in particular focusing on South Africa. And so what this presentation does, it's going to outline several different issues. It will cover many different aspects, but I suppose before I start, I should have an acknowledgement and disclaimer. The first is that this project falls under the UK International Economic Partnership. It's UK funded. All the information, all the knowledge, all the points made here do not necessarily reflect that of the UK government's official position. They reflect Jing and my position, to be clear. So what are we going to do? I'm going to run through several issues here. The first is I'm going to provide the context. I'm going to provide some overview of the Trump tariffs and focusing particularly on those that affect South Africa. We'll then move into looking at US-South African trade patterns and to try and draw some of the implications of these Trump tariffs for South Africa. I'll then focus more specifically on looking at the impact of the tariff proclamations on US tariffs imposed on South African imports or imports from South Africa. We will then draw upon a modeling approach, a partial equilibrium model approach, to try and estimate or simulate some of the potential implications of these tariffs for South African exports to the United States. And then I'm going to close off with some discussions around policy recommendations and so on. Now, this is really an area for discussion. I don't think any of us can claim really to know exactly what we need to do. So this is really an open space after this presentation and the discussants reviews for us to discuss and consider different policy recommendations to deal with this issue. So I think many of you are well aware of it's been a wild ride so far. Since President Trump took office for his second term, he launched what was known as the America First tariff policy. And the implications of that tariff policy are starting to emerge. It's pretty confusing. No one is quite sure exactly what is going on. But what emerged out of this was several or many different tariff proclamations or tariff increases. These cover the fentanyl tariffs, for example. These cover emerging trade war with China that they both withdrew from. But from the perspective of South Africa, there are two key proclamations that we should be considering. The first deals with so-called Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. These are tariffs that can be imposed on countries or on goods that are threatening national security. They follow deep investigations on the threat to the national economy or the national industries, and then subject to those investigations, tariffs can be imposed. Those tariffs are not new to South Africa. In particular, tariffs on steel and aluminium and their derivatives were imposed already in 2018 and then in 2020 on the derivatives, in which 25% tariffs were imposed on steel exports from South Africa to the US, or actually globally to the US, and a 10% tariff on aluminium. Now, many countries received exemptions, the EU, Argentina, etc., but South Africa actually didn't receive any exemptions from those tariffs. So at the start of 2025, our exporters of steel and aluminium products, or those targeted, were already facing detrimental additional tariffs in accessing the US market. But then in March 2025, what President Trump did is he removed all the country exemptions. So these tariffs then apply to all countries. He widened the product scope, so he expanded the scope of products covered. And then he also raised the tariff on aluminium from the 10 to the 25%. For South Africa, it was really the widening the scope and the increased tariff on aluminium that was of primary importance. Then on the 3rd of April, an issue of major consideration for South Africa, he then imposed an additional 25% tariff through the Section 232 process on automobiles and then parts later from May. Now, this was, of course, of key interest to South Africa because vehicle exports, passenger vehicle exports from South Africa to the US are a key part of our export bundle to the US. Then, following that, that wasn't enough. On the 4th of June, those tariffs on steel and aluminium were raised to 50%. So this is a key one set of interventions or policies that have direct implications for South Africa. The second set were the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. This is a particular act that enabled the president to make direct interventions based on national emergencies, again, without going through the process of investigations. And these were launched on Liberation Day, 2nd of April. And this covered effectively what was known as the reciprocal tariffs. These were tariffs ostensibly designed in a very simplistic way to offset the large trade deficits that the United States was facing. And they were specifically set around trying to reduce those large deficits, $1.3, I think, trillion deficit that the US is currently doing. Initially, on the 5th of April, when they kicked off, they were covering a 10% universal tariff, covering most countries with some exceptions, like Russia, where other tariffs are applying, and so on, and Canada and so on, with some additional tariff processes are in application. But then, on 9th of April, country-specific tariffs were imposed on selected countries that were regarded as having large trade deficits with respect to the United States. And South Africa fell in that bundle. And on those country-specific tariffs, they ranged very widely from 50% to Lesotho. But for South Africa, it was a 30% reciprocal tariff that was then imposed on 9th of April. But shortly after the financial markets collapsed, it was suspended for a 90-day window. And this is a major implication for South Africa, because on the 9th of July, the suspension window closes. And so we face the prospect of a 30% additional tariff being imposed on many of our products from the 9th of July. And so we're particularly interested in trying to understand the implications that this would have for the South African exports to the United States. So why is the United States so important for us? Well, firstly, it's the second largest export destination, accounting for about 8.5% of South Africa's exports, of reported at least non-gold exports in 2024. South Africa doesn't report bilateral gold exports, so we're going to focus in many cases on non-gold exports. The US is also a major source of imports. It's roughly about the second or the third or fourth most important country. We import 6.6 billion from the United States. It's about 6.9% share of South Africa's import bundle. However, despite our exports being US being an important market for exports, we still run a large trade deficit. The issue with this deficit depends very crucially on how it's measured. The United States reports a deficit of about 8.9 billion. They report imports of about 14.1 billion from South Africa. We report exports of only 8.6 billion. The key discrepancies, though, are many. I mean, one of which is gold. The US reports gold exports or imports from South Africa in their trade statistics. But even if you account for gold, we still don't cover the gap between the discrepancy between what we report as exports and what the US reports as imports from South Africa. The other aspect of this seems to attribute to some of the processed precious metals and goods like diamonds. And it appears that the US may be reporting our processed platinum products or goods that we're importing, raw material we're importing from Africa and processing and re-exporting that to the United States. It appears that they may be incorporating that in their trade statistics, which those are not South African goods. South Africa doesn't report processed and precious metals in its export bundle at all. So that's one aspect. So there's a key issue about data that we need to be concerned about. Our reported non-gold deficit, according to SARS reported statistics, is over 2 billion. But nevertheless, we run a trade deficit. The US runs a trade deficit with respect to South Africa. Now, why that's so important is it was the deficit that drove the derivation of the reciprocal tariffs. And so appropriate measurement of this reciprocal deficit really has some implication for the degree to which, at least in the eyes and the method the US is imposing, on how they should set the reciprocal tariff. And so if we, for example, accounted for another factor, in particular trade and services, what we note is that the US runs a trade surplus of 1.3 billion with South Africa. The US exports a large quantity of financial services, information communication technology services, and also it sells a lot of IP, intellectual property, to South Africa. And so it runs a large surplus. This is the key area of US comparative advantage. If we incorporated the services sector into the trade statistics, we'd reduce the reciprocal tariff calculation from 30 to 22%. On top of that, if we look more broadly at the current account, what we note is that the US runs a 1.3 billion surplus on the primary income transfers through the current account. These primary income transfers are returns to investment, the portfolio investment, but also general returns to investment. In effect, South Africa, US companies within South Africa, investors in South Africa, are earning relatively good returns from their investments in this economy, and they're repatriating those to the United States. And that's a net surplus in the US favor. If we incorporated those in the reciprocal tariff calculations, it would fall to around 18% and so on. So the point here really is, on many aspects, although we run a deficit on goods, on the flip side, The US is benefiting quite largely from the trade side. We do too, I note that, but in terms of the services side and the primary income transfers. So focusing a little bit more on South Africa's export bundle, what we note is that we look at the composition of this export, we find that we export a wide range of products, around 1,500 products. We export wattle extract. I never realized that, but you now know that. We export dried grapes. We export bolito mushrooms. We export wide ranges of products. But most of these products tend to be small in value. In fact, the top 10 products that we export to the United States, if I'm looking at a 6-digit level classification according to the harmonized system, account for nearly 60% of our export value. And I've plotted this down here on the left-hand side here. What we can see in terms of the product level, passenger vehicles are a key factor, a major contributor towards our export bundle. But then we have all the platinum group metals, which are really important. We've got ferrochromium, we have titanium ores, and we've got diamonds, etc., under this jewelry classification. So it's concentrated, our export bundle to US. And as we can see, it's very commodity intensive as well. Looking, however, from the flip side and considering how important is South Africa for the US market, how important is South Africa as a source of key imports for the United States? And here we look at the top 20 products using the 4-digit, more aggregated classification, in which South Africa accounts for a very high share of US imports. In other words, these are the products that the US is dependent on South Africa as a source of its imports. And what we find is a wide range here again. It's a key, South Africa seems to be a key supplier of productive inputs, including critical minerals. Exports slag from iron and steel. South Africa accounts for 69% of US imports of these products. Titanium 56, what we see prepared leather 49, etc. And we see a wide range of products where South Africa is an important source of supply. Embedded in that also, though, are core critical minerals. And I've highlighted those critical minerals in the green bars here. And so what we can see in things like chromium or platinum group metals, niobium, tantalum, etc., manganese, and so on, South Africa is a major supplier into the US market. In fact, in terms of chromium ores, South Africa supplies 98% of all US imports of chromium ores. And so for selected critical minerals, we're a core supplier. What's interesting, though, when we look at the composition of our exports to the United States in general, we don't compete head-to-head with many of the goods that the United States is producing. It's not that our exports are competing with their domestic producers. In fact, our exports are predominantly intermediate inputs that are being used within the production process in the United States. In other words, our exports are complementary to the United States industrialization program in general. We supply these strategic inputs that are further processed in many cases or used in the production process within the United States. So it's complementary to US industrialization, as opposed to the concern raised by Trump about the deindustrialization associated with imports from these countries in which it runs a large trade deficit and so on. Clearly, looking at South African trade with the United States, we need to consider the African Growth and Opportunity Act. The African Growth and Opportunity Act is a specific act that started in 2000 where the US grants preferential access for a wide range of products. And South Africa benefits from this particular program. We export around 3.8 billion in terms of value under the AGOA program. These products enter the US duty-free. They don't have to pay the most favored nation tariff and so on. In fact, if we look at the bundle of goods that we export to the US that are subject to duties, what we see is that many of those actually are imported under the AGOA program in order to avoid the duties. In fact, there's around an 83 to 85% utilization rate. And we can see in this pie graph here on the right-hand side, very little of our exports into the US and actually are subject to duties, MFN duties that do apply. We avoid them through the AGOA program. Now, having noted that the AGOA program is an important agreement affecting our exports or influencing our exports to the US, I think there's some key considerations that we should think a little about. The first is that the composition of our goods that we export under AGOA are very concentrated. It's predominantly vehicles. 66% of our exports under AGOA are vehicle products. The top 5 products account for around 80% of US imports from South Africa under AGOA. Citrus products are a key product, iron and steel, inorganic chemicals, precious metals, organic chemicals, ships and boats from Cape Town are a key beneficiary of the AGOA program. But nevertheless, it remains quite concentrated. The second aspect we should, in considering the trade with the US under the AGOA and so on, is that in fact, most of our exports already enter the US duty-free. They don't face an MFN. These are many of the precious metals. In fact, 59, close to 60% of our products enter the US under product lines in which no duties are applied anyway. And so most of our exports are already into duty-free. The third component it's worth considering is what is the degree to which this South African exports benefit from the tariff preferences that they don't have to pay. And when we calculated, the data suggests that on aggregate, our preference margin is around 3%. In other words, South African exports are benefiting from a 3% lower price than they would actually have to pay, a lower tariff than they'd actually have to pay otherwise. So their preference margin is pretty low. Now, for many products, though, it's not all the cases. It's 9.5% for processed food and vegetables and so on. But for key products like vehicles, our vehicle exports only really benefit from a 2.5% preference margin. Our citrus product, another key, is 1.9 cents per kilogram. It works out around under 2% preference margin. So these margins are pretty low on aggregate. But nevertheless, it remains an important preference agreement affecting South Africa's exports to the United States. But sometimes I feel it's overblown as a source or driver of South Africa's competitiveness in the United States market. Focusing now more on the tariff proclamations and trying to understand how do these tariffs affect South Africa's exports. Well, first we look at what share of exports are actually affected by these different tariff proclamations. And what we find is actually that a very high share of our exports are exempted from many of these tariffs. So under the reciprocal tariff agreement or reciprocal tariffs, they define major products, particularly raw materials and primary inputs, that to be exempt from the reciprocal tariffs. So there's no change in tariffs for these products. And for us, these cover platinum group metals, ferrochromium, titanium, wood products, copper, manganese, etc. And together they really account for around 43% of our non-gold exports into the United States as well. So a large proportion of our goods are exempted as well. But outside of that, we find that auto is a key factor. 22% of our export bundle is facing these 25% reciprocal tariffs on auto products. That's a key consideration. And another 3%, etc., are facing these Section 232 tariffs on aluminium and steel. So still, roughly a quarter or so of our exports are facing these Section 232 tariffs. The remaining 32% are subject to the full reciprocal tariffs. And why that's quite important is that accounts for around 80%, although it only accounts for 32% of the value of our exports. Those products account for 80% of the number of products that we actually export to the United States. And so the reciprocal tariffs are particularly problematic. That's 30% is particularly problematic in that it affects the largest range of products that we export, a very wide range of products, even though those products only account for 32%, a third of our exports to the United States. So these 80% of products face the prospect of a tariff increase up to 30% on the 9th of July. What does this do to our tariff protection? Well, if we look at the average level of tariff accounting for imports and the size of imports, what those tariff sets do is raise our average tariffs quite considerably. Currently, we only face an average of 0.4%. But if you add the Section 232 tariffs, this raises to 7.4%. If we then add the 10% reciprocal tariff, this rises further by 3.1 percentage points to 10.5%. The 30% reciprocal tariff, if it's imposed, will boost our weighted average tariff, the weighted average US tariff on our exports or the imports from us to 16.8%. If AGOA is not renewed in September this year, this will raise the aggregate weighted average tariff on our goods to 18% by 1.2%. I add this really just to highlight how the AGOA preferences are really overwhelmed on aggregate by these new alternative tariffs that are being imposed. They've effectively made AGOA largely redundant in this. Looking across products, what we find is there are large differences in the potential tariff effects. Here on the right-hand side, we're looking at it across different industries and by section heading. And what we find here is, for example, precious metals, metal products, wood products, and so on, and some base metal products, which including ferrochromium and so on, these tend to experience the lowest increases in aggregate tariffs. But for most other sectors, the tariffs increase by 30% or more. So for a wide range of products, we are experiencing increases in tariffs. What's also interesting is that most of the tariff increases are concentrated in manufactured goods. And so effectively what this tariff structure does, or these increases doing, they appear to be reinforcing our commodity dependency of South African exports. And so they're detrimental, particularly to manufactured good exports. We also compare these effects of South Africa compared to other countries. So we look at 221 countries, we calculate the effect of these tariff increases on US import tariffs on those countries, and we rank South Africa. And what we find is that South Africa is particularly affected, disproportionately affected by the reciprocal tariff of 30%, the country-specific reciprocal tariff. At the 10% current universal tariff that is being imposed, we're ranked 102nd out of 221 countries in terms of tariff increases, roughly in the middle of those affected. But if we experience the 30% increase from July, 9th of July, we fall down to 28%. So we are disproportionately affected by this implementation of the full reciprocal tariff. Why? Well, in part because we face a reciprocal tariff of 30%, and for many other countries, they face a much lower reciprocal tariff than us. So we're on the higher end of this reciprocal tariff. And here I've just plotted the diagrams here. What we can see is we compare South Africa against low income, low middle, upper income, high income, and sub-Saharan Africa, etc. And we can see on aggregate, our weighted average tariffs are higher than those regions as well. What's also interesting, however, is that sub-Saharan Africa and low-income countries, or sub-Saharan Africa, upper middle income, tend to be often be worse affected than high income. And falling within the sub-Saharan African countries, Lesotho, they face a 50% tariff increase, and they're the worst affected across the globe in terms of the impact. So what we then want to do is we try and understand, calculate, we would like to calculate the direct impact on US imports, or the potential effect that these tariff increases would have on US imports from South Africa. And there are really three channels that we were considering or thinking about focusing on. The first is the direct effect. This is how the tariff affects the price paid by US consumers and producers on imports from South Africa, and the effect that that would have on their demand. And this price effect depends on two aspects. It's firstly, what is the degree to which the tariffs are going to be passed on to US consumers, or are South African exporters going to absorb the tariff increases through lower prices? The international empirical evidence actually suggests that in most cases, from the 2018 shock example, that the price of the tariff in the long run passes fully on to the US domestic consumer. But it also then depends on the price elasticity of demand. How responsive are US consumers to tariffs and the ability to substitute out alternative products or domestic products? A second aspect that we were particularly interested in is the diversion. And why that's so important is the tariff on South Africa rises relative to its competitors. Citrus is a great example. Our citrus exporters will face a 30% tariff from 9th of July, potentially. But Chile, for example, and Peru only face a 10% tariff. So actually, we will see a relative tariff effect, and we may see that the US consumers will increasingly divert their imports away from South Africa towards countries like Peru and Chile that experience lower tariff increases. And so these diversion effects are particularly important for South Africa. There's a third consideration, is also the deflection of exports. Now, in particular in the case of China, is as China exports to the US are restricted, are they going to reorientate their exports to third country markets? This can affect us in terms of our market access. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, we may face increased competition in third country markets. So we focus on those three aspects. I should highlight that we don't focus on many important general equilibrium factors. We don't think about the domestic inflation effects in the US, how wages may adjust and production costs, and how these would affect the outcomes. We don't consider actually that if the tariff deficit fell in the US, this caused the dollar to depreciate, offsetting some of the effects of the tariffs and so on. And we don't consider that the tariff program or policy could affect aggregate growth in the US or the globe, which would affect our exports through income demand effects. So many of these general equilibrium considerations we've ignored completely. So how do we go about this? We build a model. It's a multi-country model. We take 221 countries. It's a multi-product. We structured over 5,000 6-digit level products. And it's a partial equilibrium trade model in that we just look at the effect at the product level and we don't include the spillover effects to other sectors of the economy or the general equilibrium effects. We base the model on US reported import data for 2024, but we replace South African exports to the US on key products like platinum group metals, passenger vehicles, and non-industrial diamonds. These are products where very large discrepancies existed between the US imports and our reported exports, and we wanted to align more closely with what we report on our export front than what the US is reporting. We also exclude gold because of measurement issues and so on. And gold is not affected anyway by the reciprocal tariffs, so it doesn't make any sense to include in this front. To run the estimate, we structure a model around what's called a nested constant elasticity of substitution demand relationship. That's technical, but intuitively, the way we think about this flow is as follows. We think about a framework in which the US demand is for a particular product. Maybe it's citrus, for example, oranges. When they first tier of this relationship, we consider how the US consumers make a choice between their domestic sourced citrus and imported citrus in general. And that clearly choice depends on what the tariff, aggregate tariff is. As the aggregate tariff rises on citrus imports, we'd expect US consumers to shift consumption to the domestic alternatives. We model that imposing an elasticity of substitution of 1.19 based on empirical literature. The second tier, however, is of considerable importance because once the US consumers have decided on how much imports of citrus they should purchase, the next choice is where do they source those imports? And here it depends on what the tariff effect is on the set of competing suppliers, international suppliers. And so if the tariff rises particularly high on South Africa, we may find that the US consumers shift the composition of their imports to the substitute products, competitor 1 or competitor 2, Chile, Peru, etc. Now on that front, we draw upon different literature as well, and we use section heading level tariff elasticities of substitution that range between 2.7 to 11. So quite a high degree of substitution in this. In other words, relative price effects would matter quite a lot in this framework. So we build this model. It was quite fun to build, and now we run a couple of scenarios. So the first scenario and simulation we run is one in which we think about high elasticities of substitution and the full reciprocal tariffs being imposed across all countries. That's 30% for South Africa, 50% for Lesotho, and other levels for other countries. So that's the first scenario. It's the worst case scenario for South Africa on 9th of July. The second scenario is one in which we still expect the full reciprocal tariffs to be imposed, but we have a much lower elasticity of substitution. In other words, consumers are much less responsive to tariff increases across different sources. And so we assume a tariff elasticity of substitution between imports of 2.53. Scenario 1, the average elasticity is around 7. And so it's substantially lower. This could be a shorter term kind of implication. Finally, scenario 3 is one in which we keep the high elasticities of substitution across sources, but we assume that the 9th of July doesn't happen and the reciprocal tariffs stay at 10% across the board. Now, to highlight quickly, when we run these, this is a moving target, as you know. We don't account for the UK economic prosperity deal. We don't quite know enough about what that constitutes. We don't deal with the recent China deal because, again, we don't quite know what constitutes that in that deal. We still assume the 20% fentanyl tariffs apply to Chinese imports from China and the Section 232 tariffs apply across the board and so on. We also don't deal with the Vietnam agreement, which we also don't know what constitutes that, where the tariff seems to fall into 20% and so on. So there are many different aspects that we don't compound, but nevertheless, this provides us some insight into the impact. So what are the results? Well, the results basically suggest that we stand to lose 2.3 billion in exports to the United States under the scenario 1. Here we plotted on the right-hand side here. If we consider the 10% reciprocal tariff, what we find is that we still lose a considerable amount, around $1 billion to the United States. What's interesting, though, if we compare these different set of results, is the role that this diversion affects us. It's the relatively high tariffs that South Africa faces under scenario 1, under the full reciprocal tariffs, that is of major detriment to it. In effect, this diversion effect doubles the negative effect that South Africa would face. And so it accounts for roughly half the impact in scenario 1. In scenario 2, it's a lower effect because we've assumed the substitution elasticity is slightly lower, but still the components of the diversion effect is quite large. Now, why is this particularly relevant for us? Is it tells us that this tariff policy in the United States is in part, its effect on us depends also on what the tariffs are on our competitors. And so if our competitors negotiate better access deals than South Africa, this amplifies the adverse loss to South Africa. In contrast, if we are able to negotiate preference or favorable access into the United States market, we benefit from lower diversion effects. In fact, we may find that diversion of US imports from those countries to us can offset some of the losses that we experience. And so this is the horrible game of negotiations that has emerged out of these Trump settings. It's a country-by-country competitive process that's emerging. And decisions of other countries have direct or diversion effects for us. I'm diverging here. If we look at the product composition, just quickly, we find obviously that vehicles and parts, these are the primary source of the reduced exports from South Africa, but it's wide-ranging. Fruit and nuts, organic chemicals, precious metals, machinery, boats, iron and steel, ores, prepared vegetables. These are all sectors or products that experience large declines in the value of exports to the United States and so on. So it's a broad-based effect. Now, what's also particularly interesting is actually if we look across the product range, we export 1,500 products. And although the aggregate loss is around 28%, that's not a good proxy for the effect across products. The median product experiences a 45% reduction in US imports. And what I plotted here is the histogram across the products of the effect. And on the horizontal axis, we've got the percentage change in US imports from South Africa. A wide range of products experience no change. These are products that are exempted from the tariffs. In fact, some products experience an increase in exports because strong diversion effects, mainly in this case from China, boost South African exports, offsetting our direct losses. But for all other products, we see very large losses in many cases, whereas the median is around 45. What we also find is many products exit the market completely, and many products experiencing 60 to 100% declines in the exports to the United States. And so it's a broad-based effect that's particularly concentrated in the smaller export products as well. And so what the net effect of our conclusion is, this policy is not only reduces the value, it reduces the product diversity, and actually it gives rise to an increase in concentration and commodity intensity of South African exports to the United States as well. We try and understand preliminary results. We try and understand some of the employment impacts. We link this back through the domestic economy in terms of shock, trying to understand how this would affect employment and so on. And effectively what we argue is that the effect is regressive on employment. The direct losses are only around 25,000 according to our estimates. They may be higher, but those losses are disproportionately felt by lower skilled workers. And so on the plot diagram here, we can see the values, but here the stars, the crosses here, blue crosses, reflect the percentage declines. And what it's telling us is that the primary school education cohort experiences the largest decline in terms of percentage terms of employment. So it's regressive from that front. We also unpack it by gender. This is a key issue to consider. And it turns out that male workers are disproportionately affected, in part because they're concentrated in some of these industries like vehicles, etc., that experience the relatively large decreases in employment. We don't account for the indirect effects at all, so the direct effects, the total effects could be substantially larger than the indirect effects. A final component of empirical work is we try and account for the diversion effects. The big fear is that the US tariffs, for example, are going to provoke a flood of cheap Chinese products into other markets. And we saw this in 2018 shock, where China diverted its exports from the US into the EU and other competing other countries and stuff. And our concern is particularly big because our estimates, at least at this point, suggest that US imports could fall by 242 billion from China. If those exports from China are reorientated to markets that we compete in, it could crowd out our exports. So we look at this in the following way. We focus particularly on what's the potential of Chinese exports being diverted from US markets into sub-Saharan Africa and the effect that this would have on increased competition for South Africa in those sub-Saharan markets, African markets. We don't consider the fact that those reorientation of Chinese exports from the US into our domestic market, which could result in increased competition by domestic producers. We don't consider that component. So we think about this relationship of deflection and the impact it could have on our exports in sub-Saharan Africa in several ways. We think a little bit about in terms of, well, what's the similarity of the export structure? How important are those destination markets for South Africa and China? What's the value of the deflected trade, and what's the product composition of deflected trade? And to summarize and to keep it short, is our overall assessment is that the concern about deflection effects from China are probably pretty low. Although the product overlap between South Africa and China is quite high in sub-Saharan Africa, we export similar lots. The products that we export overlap quite largely. All other indicators, for example, in terms of the share overlap, is pretty low. And if we look at other measures of export similarity, which is finger Cronin index, it's very low as well. And so it seems that those products that China exports a lot of and focuses on exporting to sub-Saharan Africa are not those products that we also export to sub-Saharan Africa. And what Jing has done is he worked on a constant market share analysis, and effectively he calculates roughly some guesstimate of around 133 million loss in our export to sub-Saharan Africa. And that's not a substantial amount. The effects are concentrated in some of our large partners, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Namibia, for example. But on aggregate, the percentage impact is less than 1% of our exports to those regions on aggregate. So what should we do? I think, and this is, I am somewhat hesitant because I think the policymakers are much more integrally involved in thinking about this and their heads on the block in having to figure out what to do. And in fact, the DTIC has been working quite hard already on trying to negotiate and engage with the US on dealing with these reciprocal tariffs. So we structured our recommendations just along three fronts: the short term, medium term, long term. And we'd argue that the short term, it's really about diplomacy, signaling, engagement, and the quick wins. And so the first, obviously, is about diplomacy, is engaging with the US authorities to avoid these high reciprocal tariffs. And work has been working on this front, and the DTIC and government are working around this, and there's been some engagement on it. But this is critical, figuring out how to avoid an extension or the implementation of the 30% reciprocal tariff. But I also think we may need to have better signals, because the engagement isn't entirely about a quid pro quo negotiations. We've got the big bully in the room, and in some aspects, maybe we need to signal a much greater willingness to engage with the US in terms of dealing with some of the constraints and problems that they've identified in terms of accessing into the South African market. And I think there's some quick wins here that have actually ultimately little implication for the South African economy anyway, or potentially. The US, for example, highlighted many concerns in the National Trade Estimate report, and Trump drew on these in implementing the reciprocal tariffs. And so one of them, for example, is a concern about anti-dumping, these specific duties, specific anti-dumping duties that are on US poultry exports to South Africa. They are not in percentage terms like most of the other anti-dumping duties and poultry imports. They're a specific tariff, 9 Rand per kilogram, I forget exactly what it is. Now, those are terrible tariffs because they're aggressive. The specific tariff really is detrimental to poor consumers because it disproportionately affects low-priced products. This could easily be replaced by an ad valorem tariff, which has been raised by the US. And in fact, when we look at the tariff quota, we don't even import the quantity of poultry from the US that fills the tariff quota that we've applied. So it's quite an easy one to implement. The second is they've identified blueberries. I don't quite know what the problem is, but it seems to be a key issue about access of blueberries into the South African market. This could be, I think, dealt with reasonably quickly. I think same thing is dealing with the declaration of influenza-free areas. This again relates to poultry, where for sanitary and phytosanitary reasons, for health reasons, we impose import bans on regions that's experiencing avian influenza. And we've seen this with Brazil recently. But what it appears to be the case, and the EU has also raised this concern, is that the Department of Agriculture is very slow in removing the bans once areas have been declared influenza-free. And it seems at some point, or there's a concern, that that process is bordering on protection rather than concerning health considerations. And so I think there's an issue there we can think about, and this has been raised as well. So, and relating to that is, I think there can be much deeper engagement between the US and South Africa Departments of Agriculture to deal with some of these SPS barriers and these restrictions that are being imposed. So I think we can unilaterally make some of these decisions to signal that we're willing to engage. I think a third area is really much better engagement with US companies. I think all companies should have better engagement, but in this particular context with US companies, there are around over 600 American companies apparently in South Africa. They support 220,000 jobs in South Africa. But what our data and what the results are showing is that those American firms that are located here benefit the United States enormously in terms of repatriated profits as well. And in fact, that's an area we need to really consider a bit more of how the US firms here actively benefit the United States companies as well. And so I think deeper engagement with the US companies, figuring out what their constraints are. The American Chamber of Commerce in South Africa has a whole member list. This is one area where you could have deeper engagements of working with. I think also if the tariffs are imposed, we're going to have to think about some vulnerable support, targeted support in the short term to deal with some of these. Could be export marketing assistance, trade adjustment assistance, etc., assisting these vulnerable export firms that are affected to find alternative markets. And so these are some of the short-term considerations. In the medium term, I'd argue part of the program is to think about institutional frameworks and trade agreements. How do we establish much better institutional relationships and engagements with the US and other countries, we should do anyway, and lock in trade agreements and stuff. And so in the intermediate term, this is really about securing some of the exemptions relating to reduced tariffs. This is a core focus, like vehicles. I think that's exceptionally difficult. Duane has a much better idea of vehicles. I'd be interested in hearing his point. Yeah, the US is very reticent about reducing the 25% tariff on vehicles, and I think it's very reticent to do that on a bilateral front, and so on. But nevertheless, for us, it's a critical area of interest to try and do it. The second institutional framework to start thinking about is to ensure renewal of AGOA beyond 2025. We're working hard, and Africa as a group are working as a collective to try and deal with this because it affects all of us. But South Africa actually will require its own bilateral negotiations. We've been specifically targeted around membership in AGOA, and so we're going to have specific focus on trying to deal with specific concerns raised with South Africa around continued membership of AGOA. It's not a crisis if we lost AGOA. It's terrible, but as we pointed out, the preference margins are quite low, but certainly this would be something we want to focus on. This next institutional framework issue is actually we have been quick to sign agreements and investment frameworks and very poor in implementing and in ensuring they will remain active. So we have the SACU US Trade Investment and Development Cooperative Agreement, TIDCA, which was signed ostensibly to try and work towards a trade area free trade area between SACU and the US. That is dormant. Nothing's happening. The South African US Trade Investment Agreement was dormant in last year. Minister Tau reinvigorated this agreement again, but this is a key agreement to try and fill in and ensure it's effective. It's a potential important bilateral forum for public, private sector and labor to negotiate and engage around constraints to trade between and investment between the United States and South Africa. So it comes back to better engagement with firms. The problem with these, I think, in all of them, is they're non-binding. They're agreements. And I think we should therefore also think much more carefully about, can we establish a deeper rules-based integration with the United States? They may not hold it, as we see, but still, this is something we should think about. And so I would suggest we should place on the table again the trade agreement that we spoke about that fell off the table many years ago. Should we be considering a free trade area again with the United States? and this should be considered a much stronger rule-based agreement rather than the preferential agreement or these diplomatic kind of agreements and so on. In the longer term, the critical point for us, I think, is diversification, domestic firms, domestic trade competitiveness. I think the US has signaled that it's not necessarily a reliable long-term trade partner. It's important, but we can't be too reliant on the US. We need a much more diverse space. And here I think there's several considerations. I mean, AFCFTA, we've already made great progress in trying to access. But there are two key concerns about this. The agreement is empty at the moment because the rules of origin on many vehicle products and clothing and textiles haven't been concluded. In other words, we can't trade under the AFCFTA trade protocol and trade agreement at this point. So the benefits are not being fully realized. And so South Africa, I think, can play a stronger role in driving conclusion of these rules of origin constraints to try and open up this agreement. But even then, all the data and all the analysis suggests that actually, while the tariff barriers are important, the non-tariff barriers and trade costs are even more important. And there it's about dealing with the annexes to the trade agreement on trade facilitation, custom cooperation, etc. And so that's a focus that we need to build on and push as well. I think we should also look south and east for other trade agreements. If we look at average tariffs, our market access into advanced economies is pretty easy. The average tariffs are low, with the exception of some agricultural products. Where our real barriers exist are other emerging economies. Africa, we've sorted out, but South and East Asia, we still got big barriers into those markets. And so I think we need to think about strategies to lock ourselves into those as a system of diversifying. And so maybe we need to be bold and try and join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership or the CPTPP and so on. But I think we should think about alternative trade agreements. We also should, I think, rethink about our approach to WTO. We've been reticent to engage in plurilateral discussions in the fear of undermining the multilateral discussions under the WTO. But that boat has sailed. The WTO, I don't even know if it will still exist, but within that framework, I think there's still space for plurilateral discussions on key trade issues, and one of which here is digital trade, for example, where South Africa has not been willing to participate. It's sitting on the sidelines, but this is a key issue of future trade as well. And so I would suggest we need to rethink our approach and try and engage more in plurilateral discussions, join the joint statement initiative in e-commerce, etc., and try and participate in that process. Big issue, though, for the long point is really enhancing domestic trade competitiveness. What this shock highlights is the vulnerability of South African exporters to external shocks. And one of the vulnerability arises is because of our weak competitive basis. And this talks about our critical trade infrastructure, where administration is terrible, the costs are very high, and these impose real challenges to domestic firms or exporters to adjust to adverse external shocks. And so we really need to rethink about this. I also think we should think about how we change a shock into an opportunity. And the US has identified many issues. Other countries have identified many issues about working with South Africa. And so we should open up the discussion about, do some of these local ownership requirements on foreign investment, are they that important? How important are they? Or are they constraining our integration into the global economy and so on? They talk about limits, the competition by government procurements and the limits to competition by that. Is our approach to government procurement appropriate? So I think this crisis opens up the space for us to discuss these issues and assess if they're effective in achieving the desired outcomes. Now, to highlight, to close off, these are not new. I think the government's made great efforts and working hard, and many of these points are already raised in the SS framework proposal. And so I suffer the problem here of repeating what's already been done as well. All right, thank you very much. I think that's all for now. I'll open up. I'll hand over.
Thank you, Lawrence. That was very insightful and so pertinent. A lot of key takings. I'd like to hand over to Malose from the DTI. From your experience?
No, thank you very much for the invitation. And also thank you to Prof for, I think, quite a detailed presentation and the report. So as you have started at the beginning, that summarizing 70 odds paper into few minutes. So I think it was indeed a great pleasure going through the report. So I think for my part, if I may, there are just few reflections that I would like to make. And I think one is to, yes, I do note and appreciate that the focus from Prof side was more on the South Africa's exports or US imports from South Africa. One of the important measures to always note and mention is that South Africa remains an important partner for US into the African continent. I think ourselves and Egypt, we change positions in terms of one or two, but if you look at their most value-added products do come to South Africa. So I think that will be the first reflection. And the other one, which I think Prof have addressed it very well, I must say, is the relationship need to be looked at broadly, not only as trade in goods, but Prof have talking about trade in services, have talking about the flows in terms of the dividends that accrues from US companies that have invested here. And I think one of the things that Prof has enlightened us, we have for some time been talking about 600 US companies in South Africa. Prof put it at 662. So I think it shows quite an improvement. So I think that is another reflection that we wanted to do, that as you look at the relationship, you need to look at it broadly. And if you do all the mathematics in terms of calculations, you'll see the relationship is quite balanced. Everything, when you add everything, is quite balanced. So I think that is also quite important to mention. And I think the other issue that we also wanted to make, it was also what Prof have mentioned, the issue of the complementarity in terms of the relationship. We do export quite minerals and other intermediate inputs. You look at radioisotopes that US need for cancer treatment and whatever other products. So we do contribute to technological advancement and also the issue of industrial development in the US. So I think you look at the platinums and the other minerals that Prof have mentioned, they are quite important for the US economy. So I think that is quite also important to reflect on. The other issue that I thought I should also mention, and I think here we'll also want to hear what Prof will also respond on, is I think one is to, yes, note the importance that AGOA underpins the South Africa's exports to US, accounted for, I think, around 26, if you include GSP. Then it's quite important. But I think what Prof have indicated in the presentation is that the utilization rate is between 83 to 85%. So my question there is to Prof will be, how did Prof come around that? Because if you look at AGOA lines, it's around 1,008. You add GSP lines 3,004. You come at over 5,000 or so, kind of, or 6,000 tariff lines. But Prof did indicate in the presentation that 60% of our exports is around 10 products or 10 product categories. So if you look at the number of tariff lines we use under AGOA are quite limited, probably less than 1,000 or less than 400 or 1,200 of total tariff lines, not only under AGOA. So I think for my point, for Prof to clarify, will be the issue of AGOA utilizations, because Prof puts it at around 83, 85%. So for our part, in terms of industrial development, diversification, and so on, we consider the utilization to be very low based on those numbers. So I think that is another issue that we wanted to reflect on. The other issue that I think Prof also calculated was, or indicated, was also the I think it's also the issue, but in your methodology, that will be interested in terms of the diversion, the deflation, and also the impact in the US. And then I think you have spoken in terms of the other countries that have FTAs with the US. If you look at if South African exporter was to export today to the US, AGOA will still assist in terms of the MFN, and what will only be applicable will be the issues of reciprocal tariffs and Section 232 tariffs. Yes, there are other countries like, as we've mentioned, Chile, Peru, that may have FTAs. If we were to have AGOA, it means probably the starting point is the same as them. The challenge may be the kind of reciprocal tariffs that we face. My question was, what about other countries that don't have FTAs with South Africa, but they are more competitive? So they are competitors to our products. Has that been included in the model, in the calculations, and so on? And I think the other question, Prof, that I also wanted to reflect on was the issue that you've mentioned around the reciprocal tariffs will be applicable to around 80% of our exports. And if you look at the export basket or the structure of our exports, 31% of our exports will be PGMs. Other mining is 34, is at 4.5%. You look at the radioisotopes and other products that we provide that may be exempted. That will take you to around conservatively probably around 40%. So I think then with that kind of information, then I think the reciprocal tariffs are likely to affect probably I think one of the developments that came on the 4th of June when the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminium were increased to 50% was the removal of the provision for reciprocal tariffs not to be applicable to steel and now to be applicable to steel and aluminium. So I think now if you look at the reciprocal tariffs, probably can put that to 60%, not 80%, if you look at the kind of exemptions that are applicable. So I would also like to hear Prof's comment on that. The other issue that I also noted was also the issues in the model in terms of the citrus. Prof did indicate that if reciprocal tariffs are applicable, then domestic consumers are likely to choose import domestic citrus vis-a-vis imported citrus. In this case, we are operating on a counter season with the US, whereby between May and October, South Africa is our export season to the US, and on the US side, their production season will be November, October to April. So then we have counter season. So therefore, our citrus, when it lands in the US, we don't the American consumer, the only choice we'll have will be imported citrus. So that is the other issue that probably Prof can reflect on. Then the other issue is on the impact. There have been a number of work that we have done, and also our colleagues in ITEC have done some analysis in terms of surveys, in particular looking at the automotive. And in the automotive, they came with 4 scenarios. And in their scenarios, what was indicated is that the impact to the auto sector, it was ranging between severe and just trying to get to the correct page, that it was severe, mild, and no vulnerability, and not specified. If you look at those severe in terms of the automotive, it was around 14%, and mild 9%, and no vulnerability, 10%, and not specified was 67%. So I think what we are observing from the industry is they still want to have more information in terms of understanding what will be the impact. And some of them in short term have been integrated into the value chains, and it will not be possible, at least in short term, to change some of those relationships, at least in short term. So if you look again in terms of the analysis that we did internally as the DTIC, the surveys on exporters, some have indicated, yes, there will be impact, but the US is quite an important market to them. So they have indicated that they would also like to be assisted to still access and export to the US market. So I think that, Prof, for me has also been, and I think where, Prof, there is quite a lot of convergences between ourselves and the research and the policy recommendations that we've made. One, I think, is on the issues that we need to engage with the US, and I think you've indicated, Prof, that Minister Tau and South African government have made submissions to the US, so the engagements or the submissions have went to the US. So there is certain proposals that we have made and certain asks that we have made. I think, Prof, you used the word we should start making unilateral kind of movements. So I would just want to add there is also certain asks that we have made. And in terms of our response, without going into the details of the framework, as we have mentioned, in terms of the national trade estimates of the foreign barriers report of the US of 2025, we have addressed issues around trade deficit. We have addressed issues around lack of reciprocity. We have addressed issues around unfair trade practices. And we have indicated interest and willingness to engage on tariffs and also on digital trade. So I think, Prof, I see, maybe I'm running out of time, but just to sum up one, just to say that I think the other one I just wanted to reflect on TIFA, you have indicated that we are working to resuscitate that. On the issues of barriers, we are working very hard to already on blueberries. I think Department of Agriculture have indicated they will open for 26 where fruit flies is not a problem, and there will be mitigation for others. And on poultry, there is issues that have been addressed there. And we've also indicated the interest for our citrus, expanded market access for citrus, avocados, and mangoes, and on diversification. And I think we are, the ITEC study have identified for auto, but we have also done studies on alternative markets. The issue on diversification, which I think we want to clarify, is not to diversify away from the US. As I've indicated, companies will want to diversify, will still want to export, but is to create resilience so that we can diversify on the issues of risk. And the last one, I think, is also to working to increase the issues of the trade agreements that we have signed. We have also spoken, Prof, around the issue of potential surge in imports. And there is a monitoring that, and the support to the companies in terms of that will be affected. We have seen with the floods, we have supported the companies, and I think even now there is willingness to, depending on the impact, on how we can support the industry. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Malose. Wow, very interesting. And to look at all the industries from the bolito mushrooms to the blueberries, and a great convergence between the policy space and the research space. A lot of questions for you there, Lawrence. Perhaps, would you like to respond to some of those now, or should we continue with Duane? Perhaps we continue with Duane, and then you can consolidate into a nutshell all the takings. Over to you, Duane. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. So I was just reflecting and obviously reading Lawrence's paper. Obviously lots of, I think, obviously really detailed research done. And I'd like us to maybe just look at it maybe from a slightly different perspective, and seeing that's the 4th of July and Independence Day, remind me of, I suppose, what started a lot of this in October 2024, where Donald Trump said, to me, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff. And to me, it's my favorite word. And I think we're probably all sitting back now and saying, sure, okay, there was a lot said in that sentence that is impacting, I think, all of us a lot today. But I think it's also just to bear in mind that, I mean, the trade policy of the US has got a multifaceted, I think, objectives, not just eliminating the trade deficits, which seems to be the quite a big focus with the formulas and that. Okay, also trying to combat this perceived unfair trade practices, reducing reliance on what is called foreign adversaries. Okay, which is quite an interesting selection of wording. Incentivizing the reshoring and domestic manufacturing. So that's something we just also need to be thinking about. Should South Africans start to be thinking about setting up manufacturing facilities in the US, strengthening their defense industrial base, obviously raising revenue for the American fiscus, and then obviously leveraging and advancing, I suppose, non-tariff policy goals to obviously leverage trade deals, okay, in sort of migration and defense and security. So I think those are also, we just mustn't forget that there's a multi-level issue that's been, I suppose, discussed. A second issue, I think that there's also been quite a lot of focus in the tariffs, I suppose, in two main areas today. One is that International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEEP Act, okay, where the Liberation Day tariffs sit, okay, and then the 232 of the Trade Act. So there's obviously, those are the two main policy tools that have been, I suppose, used to date. Obviously, the IEEP is obviously subject to, I suppose, a legal judicial review, which hopefully should get finalized by the end of July. That's my understanding. And then the 232, obviously quite a few investigations under the 232 Trade Act. And as Lawrence was saying, I mean, some products, iron, steel, aluminium, have actually been subject to those duties since 2019. I think it's also important to bear in mind that if there's some, I suppose, lack of success, or Trump gets overruled in IEEPA, or the 232 investigations result in different tariffs, I mean, there are other sections that the US administration can look at. One is Section 301 of the Trade Act, which obviously needs investigations. The 122 of the Trade Act, where the president can adjust import duties up to 15% for 150 days. And then the Section 338 of the Tariff Act, okay, where you can actually impose duties up to 50% or block imports if a trading partner is discriminating against US goods. So I think it's important as we're thinking about what to do about it, and obviously trade positions, also for stakeholders to also be understanding there are other trade remedies that the US has got, not only the two that's been focused on today. I think also to be thinking about what the trade deals are happening with other countries. So we've seen one with the US and in the UK. We've seen now a recent one with Vietnam. And I think obviously a template is starting to unfold. And I think give, I suppose, government and business indications of what needs to be focused on in the trade negotiations. And then I suppose the other thing just to think about is these 232 tariff investigations. So obviously we've got the iron and steel with the 50% duties. We've got automotive with the 25% duties on. Obviously, significant impact on those sectors. But I think it's also important to bear in mind that there are tariff investigations happening And something that's obviously really important to South Africa are things like critical minerals. So even though a lot of the critical minerals are currently subject to zero duty, as Lawrence was saying, we do need to make sure that we keep focus and make sure that we're not just doing a big deal, we're also making sure that businesses who are impacted by these 232 investigations, and I think there's copper, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, critical minerals, trucks and parts, and commercial aircraft. Not those ones don't impact, some don't impact South Africa, but making sure that we are encouraging government and also business to be making submissions into those specific investigations, because at the end of the day, those investigations will result in potentially other additional 2-3 duties on them. So again, just really watch carefully what investigations are put out by the US government in those 232 duties. I think, and then I suppose, as I mentioned earlier, so obviously a framework that's in terms of negotiations. So it's obviously going to be covering tariff and duty issues, but it's not only that. It's also about non-tariff barriers. Also think about rules of origin, as Lawrence was talking about. Also digital trade and services, an important part of it. And then also economic security and commercial considerations need to be put into this, or in this overall framework that we're starting to see evolve. And I think, I mean, maybe just as I start talking about, there's obviously lots of negotiations happening, and obviously business needs to be aware of those, but they also need to start thinking carefully. What do they do now? So again, important to obviously monitor all these developments, these policy developments, what's happening at a global level, at a national level, in all those negotiations. But I think it's also important for at a company level to start understanding their current one is operating model. Also start looking at their own options and supply changes, so where they're getting inputs from, okay, and then also look at the cost of acting, also doing something and not acting. So I think, and those differ by product. So obviously we do need to make sure that we also understand that as we go on this journey, the big issues to make sure that we as a business think about is the classification of your goods. Okay, so we're starting to see, like say in the aluminium sector, it's not just aluminium products, it's now products that are made of aluminium, so fridges. So make sure that you understand the tariff classification of your product and how these various negotiations and investigations are impacting your specific product. So tariff classification, and just make sure you understand that it's not as simple as it seems. And the reason why I think it's and a lot of the work I do is that people get it wrong. Okay, they get their tariff classification wrong. And when your duties are very low, say into the US and on the export side into markets, if the two options on the tariffs are one is 0 and the other one is 0, yeah, you've got maybe a misclassification, but it doesn't matter. Now the tariff classification of where goods sit and the rate you're going to be paying is going to be driven by the tariff classification. I'm recommending that business really looks very carefully at their classification of their products, especially for companies that have got a diverse set of products they export into the US market. Secondly, as we're talking, most of these duties that are going to be levied are a percentage, and they're based on what we call customs value. And that's I think some of the differences and some of the stats that Lawrence put up at the beginning. So as an example, South Africa uses the FOB or FOB method evaluation, so they exclude freight and insurance. And a lot of jurisdictions, including the US, include insurance and freight in their customs value classification or when they declare it on import. So that's just something to think about in the values that get declared on both sides. And so what we're recommending to companies to start thinking really carefully about, I mean, because I think all indications at this point seems there's going to be some tariff. on goods into the US. The base rate is 10%. That looks like, from what we see, is going to probably stay in there. You're going to be landing on somewhere, say, from a South African perspective, between 10 and 30% on those Liberation Day tariffs. So I think it's really important that companies to start thinking at their valuation structure, how they enter the US markets, and are there costs and other issues that they can be taking out of valuation, out of the valuation structure to base it, that 10 or 15 or 30% duty on a lower base. It's a real practical issue. So again, back to my comment around looking at operational structure, legal structure, an important thing to start thinking about now, because for many years those duty rates were zero, and the valuation structure didn't matter. And then thirdly, the third big impact aspect of what determines what duty you pay is the origin. So again, like where do the goods actually originate from? So some of the discussions we were talking about earlier today was things like gold. So South Africa's might be processing gold or refining it, but the actual origin of the gold or the product might be in some other African country. So it's really important that on your declarations and your calculations of origin, you need to be thinking really, really carefully about it. And then I think my final point on things like origin, we're starting to have lots of conversations with clients around, well, South Africa does actually already have quite an extensive trade agreement network. So I get the point that, yeah, we want to continue exporting to the US, but the questions I'm starting to get answered, right, okay, we've got these other trade agreements with the UK, with Europe, with Mercosur. We've got long-established ones with SADC. We've got this evolving one with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Now, obviously, I understand that is getting phased in over a 15-year period. I think companies are starting to really ask the question, right, so can trade agreements help our business now that potentially we could be at a trade disadvantage going into the US? Are there other trade opportunities that the existing trade agreements offer to us? So again, it's I think companies really starting to understand, can trade agreements make a difference? And that obviously lends us to the follow-on discussion, is what other countries should South Africa be having trade agreements with, especially in the East. I understand that, say, the trade agreement negotiations with India are sort of back on the table. So apart from a full trade agreement with the US potentially being as an option, start looking at other countries as potentials to have trade agreements with. Any other points I want to make? Yeah, so I think those are my initial points that I've got to yeah, in terms of Lawrence's paper, and hopefully some practical advice for business out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Duane. Pulling on a lot of issues too, and I see Lawrence is writing notes and keeping pace with all of it. I would also like to encourage attendees and participants to send any questions you have in the chat, and we can also incorporate some feedback there. This is a great opportunity to tap into some amazing brains from all the different sectors. So please send your questions through. In the meantime, can I hand over to you, Prof. Lawrence? And look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Great. Thank you very much, Malose and Duane. These are excellent comments, and I think fascinating to hear both your insights. I mean, from within the government, and hearing a little bit about how the DTIC and government are thinking about engaging on these trade matters. I think this is super informative. I would love to read some of these reports that you're talking about and engage further and understand how the work you're doing can feed back into kind of the empirical analysis that we're doing, so that there can be much stronger alignment in terms of supporting the negotiations, the discussions that the DTIC are engaging with some of the hard-backed economic analysis, not only that you're doing with internally, but I think externally as well. So I think that was amazing. And Duane, just in the broad point, I think I really enjoyed and appreciate the firm and the business aspect, and how firms and businesses need to approach, because I think this is critical. I suppose what I find particularly interesting is clearly institutions like Ernst & Young and so on work very closely with businesses and trying to identify those constraints. Sometimes I wonder, I'm interested from your side, the degree to which those engagements and those challenges feed back also in relation to the negotiations and discussions that the minister is dealing with, because this alignment between the way in which firms are trying to respond and the constraints the firms are worried about, I'm interested to understand, does this also directly link into how government is regulating? And this comes to, I think, the point here of a general issue in relation to South Africa this crisis highlights, is a much stronger and deeper cooperative and relationship around firm issues and firm concerns and government policies. I don't want to go on a tangent, but I often think that our broad approach to sectors and sector policies and sector industrial strategies loses insight that we're talking about a firm. And the firm constraints are not often sector specific, they're broad. Like highlighting the challenges that we face in terms of accessing international market. That's not a sector constraint in many cases, it's a firm export constraint. And so I found just on that alignment super interesting and that point here. So maybe just to respond to some of the very specific points here is, Melissa, I liked your point about how we're important for the US and the US is important for us. But I think there's an aspect that maybe that we haven't focused enough on, is how we are important for the US in terms of its access into Africa. And that alignment and that association, I think, is a key part of the relationship that that we engage with firms, but I suppose is to emphasize and so on. And so really we know there's large established relationships. I mean, the Microsoft Continental Tech Hub is really set up here to access the US market. The Amazon Web Services, again, it's based here, but it's also in part. PepsiCo, it's a great example of when they took over Pioneer, is US investment in South African firms. Massmart is the addition of about to build linkages into Africa. And so somehow to sell this point, and it can be oversold, but South Africa being a gateway, because I don't think we necessarily mean it enough and do enough to make ourselves a gateway, which means we're in the threat. But these relationships highlight the potential and the importance that South Africa can play with US firms, investment firms, in serving the broader African market and so on. So that's a dimension that I think I liked your point, and I want to close it off with some of those comments, and that's an aspect I think we could focus on. I really appreciated also your point about utilization, and it's a great point. We look at utilization as a function of existing exports, but you highlight and correctly highlight that utilization also depends on how many products we are actually exporting that are available under the AGOA preference arrangement. And you're absolutely right, there's a wide range of products in which AGOA preferences are provided, zero tariffs are provided, but we don't even access or export those particular products. And so the broader point about utilization is fantastic. I think it comes to a really interesting point about why. And this point about utilization is not just about AGOA. It's when we look at our EU trade agreement, it comes to Duane's point about firms finding alternative markets, is when we look at the product levels and we look at, for example, some of the tariff rate quotas for some of the fruit juice, etc., in our relationship with EU, we don't fill those anyway. And so what it tells us is that we have, in one argument, is we have deep supply problems in South Africa. We do not have a competitive base in which we are able to leverage off in order to access international markets to our full potential. And so this is not only just reflected, I think, in these inability to fulfill the opportunities that arise in terms of these preferential trade agreements, but it also is, I think, reflected, if we look over the trend since 2010, in actually an exit from exporting in the South African market. So in contrast to other emerging middle-income economies, real value of exports in South Africa has fallen relative to GDP compared to other upper middle-income countries. In other words, export growth in South Africa has retarded aggregate GDP growth, whereas in other countries, export growth has pushed and enhanced GDP growth. And so I think our point here comes to this long-term conclusion is, if we are really serious about trying to reorientate exports, we have to think carefully about the competitive supply base and the factors that are inhibiting our domestic firms from competing globally in international markets. Again, this reflects my own particular bias. We, I think, focus too much sometimes on how to protect our domestic industries from international competition, rather than thinking about how can we encourage our domestic industries to be competitive, to compete in international markets. And so it's a slight different way of, it's a gap, I think. I know the DTSA or DTIC are working on this. I suppose I'm trying to say we should work hard on that aspect because it's really important. It links again to Duane's point and a point of ours of finding alternative markets. If we don't develop the supply base to fulfill the agreements, the preferences that we gain are important, but we're not going to realize that full potential as well. The issue about diversion in our model and so on, I mean, there are many issues, and we'll need to provide more detail on the modeling framework, but just to highlight, we don't deal with the double counting of tariffs. For example, on the steel, we don't apply the reciprocal tariffs to the Section 232 because, as you point out, that was cancelled out. Our point about the 80% tariff line is a great one, because we also started focusing on the fact that 43%, as you pointed, of our export value is not subject to reciprocal tariff. It looks like we are fine. But that is biased enormously upwards by the fact that very few products, platinum group metals, etc., ferrochrome, these don't face tariffs, and they account for a large share of our exports. But 80% of the product lines that we actually do export are going to face the 30% tariff increase. And so I suppose that's the highlight. So it's the difference. We're just doing a product count share rather than the value share, just to emphasize that focusing too much on the big numbers makes us lose sight that actually for many products, for most products actually that we currently export, they're subject to the full tariff increase and so on. And so when we see the effect, what we find is that exactly the median firm product is going to at least experience half a decline in their exports, and for many, a complete exit from exporting. And so that's going to reduce this diversification that we are already seeing. And so I think that's just an explanation of where we get to the 80%. But it complements your point exactly, I think, that you were already making as well. About citrus is highlights. Our little case study of citrus does show the Southern Hemisphere. It reflects some modeling problem and limitations us because we don't account for Southern Hemisphere versus Northern Hemisphere in the case of citrus fully. Maybe we can play around with that model. But that little box that we show and work with illustrates that our key concerns in many cases citrus is Peru and Chile. These are also Southern Hemisphere suppliers. And so, yes, to some extent we are protected because we are different seasons from Northern Hemisphere. But on the other hand, some of our big competitors like Chile, Peru, they already have duty-free access like us under their own trade agreements. And they're only going to get a 10% reciprocal tariff, and we're going to get a 30%. And so we're going to see much stronger Southern Hemisphere competition in agricultural products exporting to Northern markets, and particularly if the tariffs there are tariff differentials between us and major competitors and stuff. I'd love to see the DTIC research and in terms of these dynamics in the short term and the long term and the potential implications. And you know, how much of a threat, how locked are are we into US supply chains that may provide resilience for South African firms? And I think Duane, I'm going to let Duane talk a little bit about that, because you're exactly right, and that's part of the engagement. I suppose I just want to add in a short point, there are issues about short-term and long-term that we need to consider, but also what it seems, at least in the work that we've been looking at, is the importance of establishing a credible commitment, in part, in many cases, about rules or an agreement that allows firms to base investment decisions off that agreement. And that's why I think AGOA is important, not so much because of the tariff preference, but it was locking in South Africa into a type of an agreement with the US that was supposedly signaling a stable kind of relationship as well. And so that's where the power of free trade areas come in, is even if the margins are low, it's a signal of a strong, hopefully persistent, rule-based relationship with a foreign partner that gives investors confidence in establishing supply chains that are hopefully rigid to global supply shocks and stuff. And so I suppose that emphasizes our point of like the TIFA is a very important negotiating process, but it's not necessarily a substitute for a hard deal, which is rule-based about reciprocal agreements. And I think that's a longer term story. Now, why I'm raising this idea of deeper reciprocal agreements, Duane mentioned it, but what we know from 2010, since the National Industrial Policy Framework shifted, or the Trade Industrial Strategic Trade Policy Framework, there was a dramatic shift around deep trade agreements to shallow trade agreements. And the best example of the shallow trade agreement is the Mercosur agreement. Now, the Mercosur agreement contains very little. Very little trade occurs under it. It's not a deep agreement. It's insubstantial in terms of locking in a deep supply relationship, I think, on a broad front. And so I would suggest let's reopen the door for deeper trade agreements with some of these new trade partners outside of the market and so on. I think, Duane, I don't have massive points because your points really are a whole different angle that I learned a lot from, which I found very informative. I just wanted to highlight one or two things here. I think your point about multi-level objectives is absolutely correct, and it makes Malose's job much harder than mine because he has to think about all of those issues, not me. And I think that's a really important. And thinking about these other tools, and I think that nub of what you're saying, in part, is that tariffs are here to stay. If we block the IEEP system, if that is blocked by the courts, it's going to pop up in other forms. And we're already going to see the pop-up in the Section 232 tariffs that are currently being investigated on many of the products that Duane was talking about. And so your point about active participation in submissions by domestic firms is critical, and that talks again about these engagements between domestic firms and government around submissions to offset some of these effects. The section, I'm going to close on this. The problem with the Section 232 tariffs, my understanding, Duane, you tell me, it then becomes very hard for the US to grant a bilateral preference around the Section 232. It universally applies, and that's what's going to make reducing the vehicle tariffs so difficult. Because so those are more dangerous than the reciprocal tariffs to some extent because they're going to be more persistent over time, and it's going to be much harder to get a bilateral preference around these than otherwise, and so on. I think I've covered some of the other points as well. So let me close off and open up the floor to others too. But those are fantastic. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very insightful. I see us pulling together a lot from all the worlds. Duane, just over to you. If we look at, you mentioned the complexity of the tariff structure. For firms there at the moment, where would you recommend they can go to learn more about it, especially in the short term during this confusing time?
I mean, apart from asking me, you mean?
We put you on speed dial.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I think obviously, I think a lot of the professional services firms have obviously put a lot of effort in. So, I mean, I know EY, we've even got like an internal intranet, Trump 2.0, where I mean, somebody has to globally track all these kind of developments. So we're up to date all the time. I get emails every day, and actually specific to South Africa. Okay. But I think the issue for me always is making sure you understand your own products. Okay. So what I've tended to find up to now is because a lot of the duties in a lot of these countries is low or zero under AGOA or MFN rates. There's been very little focus. People have been focusing on other issues around market entry and virtually no focus on tariff, value and structure, right? Okay. So I suppose all I'm saying is it's like nearly a new world because up to now, because of WTO and phase downs, duties into most developed countries are low just generally. Okay. So I think we were talking earlier about the US tariff. So like AGOA, the tariff rate, I think it's only a 2.5% preference, right? Okay. But obviously what it did do, as Lawrence, I think, rightly pointed out, it created certainty for business to then base business plans on. So I think all I'm saying to companies is obviously the US website, professional services firms have all got really, really strong responses, and we've got lots of tools, right? So it can do scenario analysis at a company and a product level, because I mean, as Lawrence says, business does business at a business level, doesn't do it at a company at a tariff level. It does it actually at its own business level. So I think that as soon as they get on top of their own products, their own data, and understand the supply chain, I think they're in a much better position to respond to this, I suppose, dynamic environment, right? Because I think it is dynamic, and I don't think it's going to change anytime soon.
Okay. Thank you. And I'm going to pull in some questions from the audience. So the first one I'm going to pull in is from Robert Vivian. He wants to know, why are these issues not dealt with via the World Trade Organization? It seems odd to have the World Trade Organization and then to have direct negotiations on the same subject. There seems to be an institutional disconnect. The specific question is, where does this leave the World Trade Organization?
So Malose might actually want to comment on this one too. My quick comment on this would be, it's not about an institutional disconnect at this point. It's about an institutional dysfunction. I mean, with the Trump administration failing to approve the members of the Pellet Board of the WTO, it's effectively reduced the WTO. It's made it in part redundant because there's no way to enforce any agreements and non-compliance with the multilateral agreements that are made under the WTO. I mean, there's obviously a longer-term failure to conclude the Doha round, etc. So there are some key institutional challenges to work through the WTO to resolve issues such as the current Trump tariffs. And so I don't think, my sense is, I'm not sure there's going to be much space within the WTO to deal with it. However, again, I'm going to try and emphasize the shift to the plurilateral. So even within the WTO, countries are starting to think a little bit about plurilateral. It's like kind of the group of the willing, groups that have common interests, working around issues of common concern. And one of which of these is the e-commerce and digital trade. And South Africa, what is nice about South Africa is they're principled. And their principled approach was, look, we're not going to break the WTO and plurilateral discussions because there is a multilateral process, the Doha round, and we want to protect and encourage that. My sense is it's dead. And so in that framework, to revive the WTO in any possible way is maybe to use it as an institutional framework for these plurilateral discussions. And so I'd really be interested to get a sense of the government's also view about how can you reform that institution in a way that can help deal with some of these challenges, such as the Trump tariffs have been imposed for us. Malose, I don't know if you have any insights or thoughts on this as well.
No, thanks, Prof. Unfortunately, I'm not really an expert on WTO or multilateralism, but I do know that we remain very much committed to multilateralism and also to WTO. But in terms of any insights I can offer beyond that, is beyond my expertise. But one thing that you raised, Prof, which was very important, I think I need to underscore it, is the issue of alignment between business and also government, because we have a number of engagements as government, either led by minister, by deputy president or president, whereby we want to open markets. So I think it's opening markets on behalf of the private sector. So that alignment is quite important. That is, there is a need to really work together, consult. We do use NETLEC, Industry Association, but I think we need to find more avenues to like this kind of an engagement where we can engage and ensure that alignment, so that whatever issues we raise with our counterparts are the issues that are very going to assist our companies. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you. And Fouche, I see you have consolidated a bunch of these questions. In the interest of time, would you like to join?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Margot. Yeah, I just thought with 10 minutes until closing, I thought it'd be good to just put some of these questions together. Forgive me if I miss some of the nuance of the questions that you asked, but we will also be sharing these questions with the specifically Lawrence and Chien, to look at they can incorporate some of the ideas. So I suppose the one big theme that seems to be coming out is what is it that we do outside of the negotiation? So are there other ways of us strengthening our position, or at least mitigating some of the impacts of these tariffs, that we can maybe put our policy thinking energy into? So the one thing that comes out quite frequently is the idea of finding alternative markets. Should we not be moving away from the US as a major trade partner? Is that possible? I know something about New Zealand was spoken about, but I also think the idea of what China essentially did during the previous trade war was brought up. Is that not something that we should think about? The other thing as well that was mentioned was the idea of fiscal policy instruments as ways of mitigating the impacts of the tariffs, and then also finally thinking about trade and services and e-commerce more specifically as ways of as compensating for some of these plans. One of the context in which some of these ideas actually fall into is the idea of the US and South Africa's fraught political relationship, that with very differing ideological positions on very important geopolitical issues, and that essentially puts a fly in the drinking water of any negotiation that might happen, and how that might help us think through this stuff. So I'll leave that over. Lawrence, maybe you can start, and then you can maybe hand over to Duane and Malose to tackle that too. Thanks.
Okay, well, I certainly will need input from the others too, because so this alternative market story, and I'm guilty of this too. It's a quick, easy, we need to find alternative markets. Turns out it's not so easy. And in this context, it's made even more complicated, because what we know is that particularly manufacturers, these firms are locked into quite complicated supply chains. And what the US tariffs are doing, and their emphasis, they basically creating huge uncertainty around these supply chains. So the post-2018, the response to firms in China was to shift to Vietnam. Now, the US is basically, they're onto them. They're blocking that restructuring and so on. So we're in this enormous uncertain world around global value chains and how they're going to reconfigure, which means that firms like South Africa locking into these is made much more complicated. And I think there's lots of uncertainty around that, which is terrible for a firm, as Duane, I think, will tell you. So I think it's hard. I think it's not so easy, and we can be quite flippant about you need to find alternative markets and so on. But maybe I want to step back. What is interesting about the AFCFTA is that this is a future growth market. And when we look at import elasticities, for example, what we know is that the elasticity of demand in general is greater than 1. So for the non-economists here, basically, if Africa grows by 5%, we have the potential to increase our exports by 10%, because it's a very strong relationship between foreign growth and our exports. And so that's very exciting. So why AFCFTA is exciting is because it has the potential to lock us in with preferential market access, in which there are very large tariff barriers, very high tariff barriers, into a market with great future growth potential. But that's only going to happen if the AFCFTA happens. And at the moment, the AFCFTA is not happening. The government's everyone's working very hard on getting it, but ultimately it's not being concluded. And so this is why I suppose locking in with these rules is so important. And I think it's a critical kind of process. So we can find lock in future growth markets through trade agreements as well. And that's why, again, Duane pointed out, is advanced economies already lowered their tariffs under the WTO. We also had to lower it because we believed we were an advanced economy. This is the arrogance of the apartheid regime. We believed we were a developed economy, so we reduced tariffs faster than we would have had to alternatively. But nevertheless, the implication is we are facing a world out there in which it's the developed to emerging economies that are imposing barriers on our exports. We do not have a strategy outside of AFCFTA to lock in to the fast-growing emerging economies. And so I would suggest trade agreements are one way to do this particularly. And Duane raised a great point, is those other emerging economies are locking themselves into advanced economies. India through their trade agreements, Europe and UK, etc., are already locking themselves into some of these economies that we are competing with. And so our concern in those fronts is we will lose preferences in many of the economies like EU to other emerging economies that are competing with us. And so it's a tough game and it's a difficult one. But one solution, I think, is through trade agreements. And so I think let's open that door as well. Fiscal policy to mitigate. I'm not a fiscal policy expert. And again, I'm very cautious because we spend a lot more than we save in terms of fiscal policy. So expanding fiscal policy beyond that is super hard. But I think there are micro areas of expertise. In the DTIC, for example, has funding to support emergency issues. And Malose will talk, I think, about this as well. And they are active and effective in many cases using this funding to support. And so I'm going to leave. I don't think it's about fiscal policy. It's about using available finances already more carefully. And Malose will talk, I think, a little bit about that. This idea of e-commerce and digital services, I think this is a massive growth area. If we look at our definition of digital services, it's growing much faster than aggregate services in South Africa as well as globally. However, our digital services trade is slower than the global growth in digital services trade, firstly. Secondly, all measures like OECD measures of digital trade restrictiveness suggest that we are relatively restrictive in terms of our rules around digital trade issues. And so we I think it's a growth area, but I think we also need to look about some of the domestic supply or regulatory constraints to the emergence of digital services, because this is a big growth area as well. And then on the geopolitical concerns, there is that's a big issue, and how we deal with that, I'm not going to stick my head and put my head on the block there. I just don't know.
Maybe building on what Lawrence said. So, I mean, I've been sort of getting clients to try and unpack, like, is there an opportunity in the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, right? Okay, so lots of political will, okay, and Lawrence, as you say, it's obviously being implemented unevenly is probably the right way to put it, okay, with still some barriers, logistics and otherwise, which are probably going to be hampering its benefits. But I think a lot of the analysis I've done at a company and a product level shows that there are good market opportunities for South African products, right? Okay, so currently, I suppose at a really big level, you've got, of the total trade that comes into Africa, only 13% or so, or the latest data is intra-region trade. Okay, the rest of it comes in from outside the region. And when you start looking at a product level, that in theory is a market opportunity. So, it's being serviced by somebody else outside South Africa. But I think what I've found is that most companies, don't know where to access that data, don't understand that the market opportunity exists, that the trade agreement is putting before them. So again, I suppose arming yourself with trade information, so trade data, and then understanding how the trade agreement is going to give you some kind of preference over exports, say, from China into Africa, into Ethiopia or wherever. So I think it's just trade negotiators can negotiate a trade agreement for you, but business will take advantage of it. But if they don't understand the detail that's in the trade agreement, they'll never take advantage of it. That's how it works, right? Okay, so I think some of my recommendations, one is, how do we create more platforms for businesses to actually understand how they can take advantage of these trade agreements? Because if they don't, we'll be saying, well, we negotiated this and the trade flows, we still got 87% of the trade coming into Africa from outside Africa, and that would be really unfortunate. A second point is, I think with, I suppose, fiscal support, obviously certain industries are going through reviews. So a good example is automotive, and that's obviously quite relevant for this discussion to the US around, as we're going through a review of the APDP incentive program, which is fundamentally a customs support program, is how do we make sure that we think about in the redesign of that program around support around exporters that could be prejudiced by this global trade turbulence. Okay? How do we think about designing those kind of elements into the revised version of APDP or any other incentive program that's getting developed by DTIC? Cool, thank you.
No, thanks. I think for my part, it's just I think everything has been aligned, but it's just again to underscore that indeed we can open trade markets through concluding trade agreements. The Department of Agriculture can conclude protocols in terms of opening for agricultural market access and so on. But I think what is important is what has been underlined in the study, the issue of achieving domestic competitiveness, the issue of when the barriers arise, are they brought to the relevant authorities on time to discuss? Because one of the things that we always sometimes don't get, at least for my part, there will be challenges that our companies face in certain markets, but those are never brought to our attention to discuss and try to resolve with our counterparts. So I think this is just to encourage companies that whenever there are barriers to trade, let's look at them and see how we can resolve. The other issues around, I think most of our logistics, yes, most of our trade has been with the Southern Africa. I think 70% of our trade in Africa is within our neighboring countries. So I think there is the ACFTA provide an opportunity because it allows us now to access markets in East and North Africa. So I think that is quite important. And that in itself brings the complications of logistics, because most of our trade has been focused on from Africa to Europe, US, and so on. But now it's amongst ourselves. So I think these issues probably long term will need to focus on them. So I think the issue of physical support, the DTI, as I've indicated during the issues around the floods and so on, there've always been support that has been provided to companies, rebates in terms of inputs that may be required, and financing through various government DFI. So I think, but for me, that is not necessarily the issue or the problem. The problem is when challenges arise, do we sit down and identify and find a solution that is tailor-made to a specific challenge? Because we can have all these instruments, but if we don't target them correctly, I think we'll probably still talk about the same topic in future. But I would say let's find that alignment, let's discuss, and let's increase trade. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And in the interest of time, we're going to look at closing off, but some really key insights there in terms of alignment, both between research, private and public sector, as well as seeing what opportunities we can find during these difficult times. And thank you very much to our distinguished panelists. It has been an absolute pleasure having you with us today. And to our attendees, thank you for all your questions. We still have a few of them that have come through, but we will definitely keep you posted with the responses to those. But it is 12 o'clock on the dot on Independence Day. And what a pleasure it has been to have you with us. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. That was great.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.